This is a family story, and it was a story I was telling my mother a number of years ago, and she laughed and said, "You should write that down." So, being a dutiful son, I did. It's about my Aunt Bernice and her husband Jack. I don't think Jack was her first husband. Bernice was, well, here's the story. In the summer of 1962, my family, with the exception of my brother Warner, who was in the U.S. Army in Germany, took a road trip to California. My father, mother, and sisters, Sarah and Nancy, and I were traveling in our 1962 red Ford Galaxy. This was the first and last Ford my father ever bought, but that's another story. As I was 15 at the time, I had a learner's permit to drive, and I marvel yet at my parents' confidence in allowing me to drive that red Ford at some pretty high speeds on what were by today's standards some pretty narrow roads. I do recall driving into the Los Angeles basin and stopping at the first opportunity to allow my father the stress of driving through that quagmire. The primary reasons for us to go to Los Angeles, aside from visiting Disneyland, were to see my mother's brother Tom, who lived in West Covina, and my mother's sister Bernice and her husband Jack McMean, who lived on a boat moored in Wilmington Harbor. We did have a wonderful visit with my Uncle Tom. He introduced us to a girlfriend. This was an interesting concept to us, coming from Minnesota, where all the adults we knew were either married or in the religious, and he took us for a ride to show us the Stack, a phenomenon where 4 or 6 freeways intersected. During the entire visit, he was able to keep a non-stop line of snappy patter. This, however, is Bernice and Jack's story. We arrived at the harbor in the morning. There was a locked gate, so my wonderful Aunt Bernice was there to greet us. Bernice was a wildly effusive, jubilant, loving person, and she was delighted to see us. Hugs and kisses abounded, and when we walked out onto the dock, we passed a somewhat derelict craft. Bernice stopped and said, "Warner, this is it. What do you think?" Now, my father was on this trip mostly because it was important to my mother. He also had a medical condition of which we were not fully cognizant. His reaction to Bernice was one of marginal tolerance, and upon reflection it seems like this was a harbinger of the trip for Dad. To my adolescent mind, this entire interaction was very funny. A few berths further on held their boat. I don't remember the name, but they did have an official-looking piece of paper in a frame indicating that the yacht had previously been owned by Sebastian Cabot. This was impressive. The yacht itself was a pretty classy deal. There was some type of cabin forward, and the galley was comfortable, as I recall. But one of the most notable features was my aunt's medicine stash. Now, Bernice worked as a nurse, and I expect that she was conversant in any number of ailments, and she was also aware of modern chemical remedies. At one point, perhaps it was upon boarding, there was a request for an aspirin or something, and with her unique flair, Bernice walked over and threw open the doors to the cupboard. There were 2 or 3 4-foot shelves crammed with a variety of pillboxes and medicine bottles. This was not like anything we were used to in Minnesota. We later learned, or at least I realized, that Bernice and Jack actually lived on the boat, and this, I suppose, made it reasonable for their supplies. Shortly after we got all our things on board, we left. We were bound for Catalina Island, 26 miles away. I remember that from the song. Sometimes after we got through the breakwater, the seas began to roll, and I experienced that feeling of nausea commonly known as seasickness. But this soon passed without getting too serious. As I recall, it may have been about this time that the engine stopped. We had run out of gas. "This is no problem," said Uncle Jack. "We have another tank. I just have to switch it over." Switching to the other tank proved to be somewhat more complicated than it originally seemed. Jack had some trouble with the whole operation, and at one point he called out to my father, "Warner, you're an engineer. Why don't you fix it?" Even my adolescent mind sensed the irrationality of this question. My father's response was exactly appropriate. "Jack, it's your boat." This hardly fazed my uncle. "Well, sure it is, but I don't know what's wrong." So the two of them set about switching over to the second tank. Sometime during these machinations, Jack tried to start the engine with no success. Eventually, they did manage to get the tanks changed, and this time the engine did engage. However, during the earlier attempt, Jack had put the gear in reverse. So the engine fired up, the boat moved backward, causing the dinghy line to be caught up in the propeller. By the time anyone was aware of this complication, the dinghy overturned and filled with water. We attempted to upright the dinghy from the aft section of the yacht. This was not possible. The next try was to continue the motor with another line attached to the dinghy. However, with the propeller so fouled by the original dinghy line, combined with the weight of the water-filled overturned rowboat, it was impossible to maintain any sort of forward speed. So my uncle did the one thing that I will always remember. He went to his radio. I suppose it was some sort of a shortwave. And he called, "Mayday! Mayday!" I had never seen anyone actually do that. Outside of a movie or a television show, I had visions of the Coast Guard and Lloyd Bridges racing to our rescue. Instead, about a half an hour later, a salvage boat pulled up. Whether money changed hands or not, I don't remember, but they were able to upright the dinghy and we were off again. We motored into Catalina Harbor, and there was one last mooring buoy for us. Jack may have reserved it, but I think we simply made it in the nick of time. The water in Catalina Harbor was crystal clear, and a person could see the bottom clearly through the depth was 20 to 30 feet. So my sister Sarah and I went swimming. We somehow didn't muster the courage to dive from the flying bridge, but we did dive off the stern. We tried to untangle the last of the dinghy rope from the propeller, but couldn't. So my aunt charmed the young men who were moored next to us, and they, with snorkeling equipment, were able to free the propeller. The rest of the evening was, as I recall, rather uneventful. I did get to sleep on the cushions at the stern of the boat. Later comparisons with my sisters verified that I had the best berth on the craft. But that's their story. The next morning there was a somber mood on the boat. Apparently my father either had some sort of seizure during the night, or he was simply not feeling well. The upshot of this was that my father, mother, and sister Nancy were all going back to the mainland via a much larger vessel, and they were leaving that morning. How or why Sarah and I stayed is lost somehow in the shroud of old memories. My recollection is that there were no hard feelings. Dad just simply was not going to stay. I believe there are times when I also exhibit my father's stoicism. So we watched them go, and it was fine. We then took off to explore the island. Sarah must have gone with my Aunt Bernice, as I recall spending the afternoon in the single company of my Uncle Jack. We went to the top of a hill that overlooks Catalina Harbor, and he regaled me with all kinds of stories, and I was having the time of my life. Later in town, he bought a new sailor's cap. It was blue and had a shiny black brim, the type that yachtsmen wore. His previous cap was of the same design, but it was white. He let me wear it. After dinner, the four of us went into town and saw the movie Cape Fear at the Avalon Ballroom. The famed ballroom had been converted into a movie theater. It seems a shame that we didn't get to see Glenn Miller or the Dorseys or even Lawrence Welk. But then again, I suppose I was happier seeing a thriller movie than waxing nostalgic. I was a target of mass advertising, and their aim was very good. That night I resumed my bunk at the stern. There was now plenty of space inside the boat, but I really enjoyed sleeping on the cushions, listening to the waves lapping against the boat and breathing the fresh air. The next morning came with a nearly impenetrable fog bank. We had an interesting breakfast, as I recall, leftover steak and orange juice. Then we departed for the mainland. As we left the harbor, the sea was very calm. It was almost like being on a mirror, except there was no reflection. We could only navigate using the compass. Uncle Jack and I sat in the flying bridge, and I was allowed to steer. "This is not a car," Jack said, as I would make instant corrections any time the compass needle strayed from the heading he had given me. You have to make slow, easy adjustments to allow for the movement of the ocean. By this time, the swells had begun to increase in size, and we found ourselves bobbing up and down with increased velocity. This made being on the flying bridge rather uncomfortable, so we climbed down and ran the controls from inside the cabin. After a period of time, 1 hour, 2 hours, the fog lifted and we found ourselves outside of the breakwater. The breakwater is a man-made barrier upon which the ocean waves are curbed and behind which water traffic can move in a more orderly, controlled fashion. At least that's what it seemed like to me. It was also quite a bit warmer in the breakwater, and there wasn't as much wind, so I took my shirt off. Now, a few days earlier, our family had been to the farmer's market in Los Angeles, where I had purchased a small tiki. At the time, there was a popular television show called Adventures in Paradise. The main character was a handsome man who spent a good deal of each segment bare-chested and sporting a tiki suspended around his neck. Tiki is a small figurine bearing a resemblance to the stone statues found on Easter Island. Now I was back on the flying bridge with my shirt off, wearing Uncle Jack's old yachting cap, proudly displaying my new acquired ornament. My uncle was beside me, adorned with his new yachting cap. He did have his shirt on. However, he had not gotten around to putting his dental bridge. He had no front teeth. I guess it was because it was more difficult for him to project. He leaned over to me and we passed a salvage vessel in the breakwater. "Ask him which way to San Pedro," Jack whispered to me. I gathered up all of my shirtless, tiki-sporting yachting cap bravado and hollered out at the man, who immediately responded with a howl of laughter that we were indeed in San Pedro Harbor. I gave my uncle a dirty look. Shortly after that, we arrived back at the berth assigned to Bernice and Jack's boat. Dad and Mother, along with Nancy, were waiting on the dock. Apparently, we were a couple of hours late. Our parting was brief. While I had had a grand adventure, I really don't believe my enthusiasm was shared by my parents. This was the last trip we took as a family to visit family.
I'm Robert Sarazin Blake. Join us for songs, guests, and special requests every Sunday from the kitchen table.